a gated estate in the New Mexico hills. 23 years of quiet privacy. Then, on a cold February afternoon, two maintenance workers glance through a window and see something that will not stay quiet. What investigators found inside would take weeks to piece together, and even then, not everything would add up. This is the story the official record actually tells. Not rumor, not theory. What happened, and what still isn't explained. Santa Fe County doesn't see many days like February 26, 2025. The morning had been ordinary, cold, clear, unremarkable. On a quiet stretch of gated land outside the city, two maintenance workers arrived to service the property. The same routine they'd followed for years. They didn't expect anything different this time. They knocked. No answer. They tried the door. It was unlocked, which itself was unusual for a home known for its privacy. Inside, through a window, they saw something that made them stop moving. They called for help immediately. Within the hour, Santa Fe County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the estate belonging to Gene Hackman, the 95-year-old actor, and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, 65, a classical pianist. What they found inside would take investigators weeks to fully process. And even then, some of it would remain unresolved. Arakawa was found on the bathroom floor, dressed in a sweatshirt and sweatpants. An open prescription bottle sat on the counter nearby, with loose pills scattered across it. Hackman was found in the mudroom, near the kitchen, a cane and a pair of sunglasses close by. The two bodies were in separate parts of the house. One of the couple's dogs was found nearby Arakawa. Alive, another dog was discovered dead in a crate. Deputies noted no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no disturbed locks, and yet something about the scene didn't sit easily with investigators. The sheriff's office would later describe the circumstances as suspicious enough to warrant a full search warrant and a thorough investigation. Even as they stated, there were no obvious signs of violence. Officers worried, understandably, about carbon monoxide. They opened doors and windows throughout the house as a precaution. It would take days of testing to rule that out completely. What stood out immediately, though, wasn't inside the house. It was the timing, because as investigators would soon learn, the two bodies had not died on the same day, not close to it, and the gap between those two deaths would become the question that shaped everything that followed. How does a house this private, this well-kept, sit undisturbed long enough for that gap to happen at all? To understand why nobody noticed sooner, you have to understand the life Gene Hackman built after he stepped away from Hollywood. He hadn't made a film in over 20 years. He hadn't given an interview in nearly as long. Those who knew him described a man who had deliberately, methodically, closed the door on public life. The estate reflected that choice. Set behind gates, tucked into acreage that kept neighbors at a comfortable distance. The property was designed for seclusion, not spectacle. Hackman and Arakawa were known in their gated community as private, even guarded. According to their daughters, the couple never hired a regular housekeeper. Deputies who searched the home after the discovery noted that it was tidy despite this, kept in order by the couple themselves. His daughters, Elizabeth and Leslie, later told investigators their father had been declining. They described having to remind him, more than once, that a certain day was his own birthday. They said he avoided cell phones entirely, relying only on landline calls, a detail that speaks to how disconnected he had become from the tools most people used to stay in daily contact with the outside world. This is where privacy stops being a lifestyle and starts becoming a liability. A well-kept, isolated home with no daily visitors, no housekeeping staff, and an elderly resident increasingly unfamiliar with modern communication is a home that can hold a secret far longer than it should. Not a hidden secret, just an unnoticed one. There were no daily deliveries logged, no routine staff check-ins, nothing built into their daily rhythm that would have forced a third party through those doors on a predictable schedule. The gated community's caretaker only became involved after the maintenance workers reported what they'd seen. Before that call, No one outside the household had reason to check on them at all. It's tempting to look at a property like this and imagine something being hidden deliberately. But the more investigators dug, the more it looked like something simpler and sadder. Two people who had built a life explicitly designed to keep the world out. At the exact moment in their lives when they needed the world to notice something was wrong. And one of them had already been gone for weeks. Among the objects investigators collected from the home, one small device would end up telling them more than almost anything else in the house. Gene Hackman wore a pacemaker, and pacemakers, unlike people, keep a quiet, uninterrupted record of the heart's activity, whether anyone is paying attention or not. When investigators pulled the data, Sheriff Adan Mendoza told reporters that the device's last recorded event occurred on February 17th, 9 days before the bodies were discovered on February 26th. It's not a definitive marker of the moment of death. Pacemakers record cardiac events, not a precise timestamp of a person's final breath, but it gave investigators their clearest anchor point yet in a house with no witnesses and no camera footage to consult. 9 days is a long time for a 95-year-old man in cognitive decline, in a home with no live-in staff. To have gone unnoticed, it raises questions that have nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with the ordinary, unglamorous mechanics of isolation. Who checks on someone who has spent decades making sure no one checks on him? Investigators also collected 2 cell phones from the home, along with a monthly planner. They found no surveillance cameras installed anywhere on the property, a detail Mendoza confirmed directly to reporters. For a home this large, this secluded, that absence matters. There was no footage to review, no time-stamped record of movement inside the house in those final days. Only the objects left behind, and what the body itself could tell investigators after the fact. The initial autopsy findings noted no external trauma on either body, no signs of a struggle, no indication that a second party had come and gone. Investigators were left instead with a slower, colder kind of evidence, a pacemaker's last signal, a scattering of pills, a cane left leaning near a mudroom door. It is easy, looking at a case like this, to want a single dramatic explanation. The evidence resists that. What it offers instead is a timeline, built piece by piece, of a man who likely died alone, in a home built to ensure exactly that kind of solitude, sometime in the days following February 17th. But his was not the first death in that house. If Gene Hackman's death raised hard questions, Betsy Arakawa's raised harder ones. Investigators determined that she had died first, and not by days, by weeks. Records show Arakawa had researched symptoms of illness in the period before her death, searches that would later help investigators piece together a possible timeline of her final days. The official cause of death, once determined, was hantavirus, a rare but serious illness transmitted through exposure to rodent droppings and urine, most often found in enclosed spaces like garages, sheds, or outbuildings with poor ventilation. New Mexico public health officials would later confirm that hantavirus cases are not common, but are not unheard of in the region either. In the year of her death, the state recorded over 100 cases and dozens of fatalities from the illness. Arakawa's case fit a pattern investigators had seen before, just not one anyone expected to find in this particular home. What makes her death especially difficult to sit with isn't the illness itself. It's the gap that followed it. Betsy Arakawa is believed to have died roughly 3 weeks before her body, and her husband's were discovered 3 weeks in a home behind gates, on a property large enough to include multiple detached structures, with a husband inside who was, by that point, in advancing cognitive decline. There is no evidence of foul play here, no evidence anyone concealed what had happened. What the timeline suggests instead is something quieter and more unsettling. A household where the one person capable of raising an alarm was no longer able to recognize that one needed to be raised. Investigators have not been able to determine, with certainty, whether Hackman understood in those following days that his wife had died. What they do know is that he continued living in that house, alone, for over 2 weeks afterward, before his own final recorded cardiac event on February 17th. It's a detail that reframes the entire case, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a slow, largely invisible tragedy that unfolded over the better part of a month. Inside a house too private for anyone to notice in time. And that privacy would raise one more question investigators had to rule out before they could close the case at all. Long before investigators arrived at the estate, Hackman's own family had already been watching him change. Elizabeth and Leslie Hackman, his adult daughters, gave investigators an account that painted a clear picture of a man in decline. Not suddenly, but steadily, in the ordinary way dementia often progresses. They described having to remind him multiple times, on his own birthday, that the day held any significance at all. It's a small detail, but it says something larger about where he was cognitively in his final year. They also told investigators he had stopped using a cell phone entirely, relying only on a landline, a choice that reflected not stubbornness, but a genuine unfamiliarity with the technology most people used to stay reachable. This wasn't a case of concealment. His daughters weren't withholding concern. Dementia and Alzheimer's related decline often move this way, quietly, in ways that are easy to miss unless you're checking in often, and harder still to catch when the person in decline has spent a lifetime cultivating distance from exactly that kind of checking in. The daughters also confirmed something that mattered a great deal to investigators piecing together the household's daily rhythm. The couple did not employ a regular housekeeper. Despite this, deputies who processed the scene noted the main residence was tidy, suggesting the couple, even in decline, maintained the home themselves for as long as they were able. This detail matters because it closes off one possible explanation investigators had to consider. There was no staff member who might have noticed something was wrong and failed to report it. No housekeeper who could have checked in during those critical weeks. The absence of routine outside help wasn't an oversight. It was the way this household had always operated, and it meant there was simply no one positioned to catch what was happening until it was already far too late. Which raises a colder, more clinical question: if nothing points to concealment and nothing points to neglect by outsiders, what exactly were investigators still testing for in those first days at the scene? Even with two bodies showing no external trauma, investigators did not simply accept the obvious explanation and move on. In a case involving no witnesses, no camera footage, and a scene deemed suspicious enough to warrant a formal search warrant, ruling things out was just as important as building a timeline forward. The first concern was carbon monoxide. It's colorless, odorless, and can incapacitate quickly, which made it a natural early theory for two people found dead in separate rooms of the same house. Officers opened doors and windows at the scene as an immediate precaution. Later, both bodies were tested directly for carbon monoxide exposure. Both came back negative. Investigators didn't stop there. The New Mexico Gas Company was brought in to conduct an extensive inspection of the home's gas lines and appliances. Their investigation found no significant leaks. There was one minor exception: a barely detectable leak at a single stove burner, registering well below any level considered dangerous. Beyond that, inspectors issued a handful of code enforcement notices unrelated to gas leaks, involving a water heater and several fireplace log lighters. Paperwork issues rather than safety hazards. Sheriff Adan Mendoza confirmed publicly that natural gas was not believed to be a factor in either death. With that ruled out, and no evidence of blunt force trauma, poisoning, or forced entry, investigators were left with a picture that pointed toward exactly what the physical evidence had suggested from the beginning: two deaths from unrelated natural causes, separated by weeks, in a home that gave no indication of anyone else's involvement. That conclusion didn't happen quickly. It happened only after each alternative explanation was tested, one at a time, and eliminated. That's a slower, less dramatic process than most stories about mysterious deaths would have you believe. But it's also the reason investigators could eventually speak with real confidence about what didn't happen inside that house. What remained was a different kind of investigation altogether. Because if nothing in the house itself explained Betsy Arakawa's death, The explanation had to be somewhere in the environment around it. Hantavirus doesn't arrive without a source, and identifying that source became the next phase of the investigation. On March 5th, roughly a week after the discovery, New Mexico state health officials conducted a full environmental risk assessment of the property, a routine step in any hantavirus-related death, meant to protect investigators and family members who still needed access to the home. What they found didn't point to the main residence. The couple's living quarters were assessed as low risk for hantavirus exposure. Instead, investigators found the evidence in the property's outbuildings, 3 detached garages, and several smaller structures scattered across the estate. Inspectors documented rodent feces, nests, and both dead and live rodents across these separate buildings. Live traps were found on the property as well, suggesting the couple, or their staff, had been aware of a rodent presence and had taken some steps to manage it. This detail matters because it answers a question that might otherwise linger uncomfortably. It wasn't that the couple lived in filth, or that their home was neglected in some obvious way. The primary residence remained, by every account, clean and orderly. The risk existed at the margins of the property, in the kind of detached structures that don't get the same daily attention as a home's interior, especially on an estate this large. Public health officials in the state confirmed that hantavirus, while uncommon, isn't unheard of in the region. Exposure typically happens through inhaling airborne particles disturbed from infected rodent droppings, often in exactly the kind of enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces investigators found on this property. It's a mundane explanation, and that's precisely what makes it credible. No elaborate concealment, no unexplained anomaly, just an environmental hazard, present on large rural properties more often than most people realize, that intersected with an isolated household at the worst possible moment. With that answered, only one piece of the case remained unresolved, not because investigators failed to look, but because some questions don't have clean answers even after the looking is done. By the time investigators closed the case, they had built a timeline that accounted for almost everything. Betsy Arakawa likely died in early February, from hantavirus exposure traced to rodent activity in the property's outbuildings. Gene Hackman continued living in the house afterward, his own health declining, until a final cardiac event around February 17th, consistent with his cardiovascular disease and advancing Alzheimer's. Neither death showed signs of trauma, foul play, or forced entry. Carbon monoxide and gas leaks were tested and ruled out. The official record closed the case as 2 deaths from natural causes, and yet the record itself leaves gaps that no test result fully closes. Investigators have never been able to say with certainty whether Hackman, in his condition, understood that his wife had died, whether he searched for her, whether he simply lost track of the days. The way his daughters said, he sometimes lost track of his own birthday. There's no camera footage to consult, no witness account, no way to reconstruct those final 2.5 weeks with anything more than the physical evidence a house quietly gives up to investigators after the fact. That absence of certainty isn't a cover-up. It's simply the limit of what evidence can tell you about a person's internal experience in their final days, especially a person whose memory and awareness were already fading. The official record can tell you what happened to 2 bodies. It can't tell you what one confused. Grieving, declining man understood about the woman he'd shared 33 years with, alone in a house built, deliberately, to keep the rest of the world at a distance. That's the part of this case that resists tidy conclusion. Not a locked door, not a hidden chamber, just an old man, increasingly lost inside his own mind, living out his final days in the same rooms where his wife had already been gone for weeks, in a home so private that no one on the outside had any reason to notice until it was far too late. Some mysteries end with an answer. This one ends with a silence that the evidence simply cannot fill.